We are going to take your soil to the doctor. Just like if you have body degradation issues, might need to go to the doctor for a checkup. You can go do that checkup in the field, and you can do that checkup in the lab. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Is everybody seeing my screen? Okay, great. All right, so soil health assessment. How do we go about that? Well, going to show this slide again. I just think it's so critical. I'm going to tell a bit of a story about it. This is in New Hampshire. I know it's not out west, but it's an experience that I had with my long-term colleague, Doran Cox, who's doing some pretty fantastic stuff. This is on his operation on the left. Organic, highly diversified, all sorts of crops from grains to vegetables to livestock. And they've been experimenting with all sorts of stuff for a long time, right? This is what his soil looks like on the left there. On the right is a farm that's maybe 10 minutes down the road, has been in production for at least as long. Iconic farm right there, but conventional vegetable operation, no cover crops, lots of tillage. The story from this farmer on the right was that this field used to grow strawberries. When it couldn't grow strawberries anymore because they just didn't seem to do well, they kept getting all sorts of pests. He started growing sweet corn, and now, gosh, look at what's happening with my sweet corn. I can't even grow sweet corn anymore. I think I just might quit farming. He was set in frustration, right? Now, if you look at that soil, you can tell immediately, just based on what we've talked about so far, that there's some issues, right? It looks kind of grayish light. It looks like there's a bunch of cracks. It looks like the soil is eroding. It looks like each raindrop that hit left a little dent in these clods that shouldn't be there. This soil is in really rough shape. So we've got the classic, soil health management system on the left, very degraded system on the right. Now, when it comes to soil assessment, what every farmer knows to some extent is that they can send a soil sample to a lab and get an analysis back, and that's going to tell them how to manage their soil. What it tells them is, okay, your pH is low, you should add some lime. Your phosphorus is too high, you should make sure not to add any more. Your potassium is low, right? It gives you fertilizer recommendations. And those are a big source for our high yields these days. These two soils are the same soil type, but on the left, that Buxton silt loam has been well managed. That soil test sample, the standard soil test sample, came back saying, yeah, phosphorus kind of on the low side, potassium is definitely a little bit too low, pH is kind of on the low side. It really needed some soil chemical work. That hadn't been what they've been focusing on. Sample on the right said everything was totally fine. What are we missing here, right? If you went to the doctor and you had a broken leg and they never bothered to do an x-ray, they wouldn't know you had a broken leg. If you had COVID and nobody knew how to test for COVID, they wouldn't know to test for that, right? So it's when you go to the doctor and you test, you assess health for something, you have to be looking at the right thing in order to actually know what's wrong. Soil health assessment was non-existent when I started working in soil health at the time. There was soil quality research going on, and a lot of researchers had done a lot of fantastic work trying to get at how do we measure biological and physical function of soil, and there was nothing that a public landowner could get to. And so this downward spiral of soil health has occurred in part because we've only focused on the chemical aspects of things. We haven't focused on the biological and physical. So here's a range of reasons for why we might want to assess soils, right? One is to understand constraints or resource concerns beyond just those nutrient limitations or excesses that we've been focused on that have been great to be able to assess, but they're not enough. They're just a very small part of the picture. It can help us target management practices so we can alleviate those constraints. It can help us measure soil improvement or degradation from that management. It can facilitate applied research if we come up with new innovative management practices and want to see how those do at actually improving soil function. It can improve awareness of soil health and its benefits, and that's a lot of what we did when we developed the Cornell Soil Health Assessment. We took that test to farms and showed farmers, here, look, your aggregate stability is low. And we got a lot of, oh, wow, I've never seen that before. Ah, okay, well, so what do I do about that, right? But it takes that being able to show somebody, look, you've got a broken bone. Of course your leg hurts, right? That was new at some point, and now it's just how we do things. And then things like enabling evaluation of farmland, right? In the future, there may well be a case where somebody can sell their farmland for much more if it's in really good health. Enable assessment of farming risk, and enable policy recommendations that are science-based, right? So there's a lot of different reasons that soil health assessments could be used. On to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Bianca. Yeah, so sticking with this soil health and human health analogy, I wanted to make some comparisons here. So we have inherent properties of soil that are really unchangeable. So that might be the texture or the mineralogy. What's the parent material? How deep is that soil? And on the human analogy side, we're looking at genetics. But then there are dynamic properties that are changeable by management. With soil, we have already talked a little bit about how soil organic matter can be changed, how aggregate stability can be affected by management, and even pH is another dynamic property. With humans, we can change our weight or our heart rate or blood pressure. We can treat those things. And then there are environmental factors that affect the overall health, that those things external to the soil itself, like rainfall and temperature, do affect how soils can perform and how the assessments can be related. Just like conditions around a healthy human, like the toxins in their environment or their level of stress. We can affect those things by management, and that analogy is like crop rotation or tillage versus exercise and diet or medication on the human side. And then when we look at indicators, so when we take our soils to the doctor, like we would take a human to the doctor, we test certain parameters. And an indicator for soil health might be, for example, soil respiration, which is a measurement of general microbial activity. We could do the same thing on a human and test for cholesterol levels, which can reflect the cardiovascular health and the amount of efficiency of that system. And then we want to connect connect health indicators to outcomes. And when we're kind of looking at healthy soil, we talk about soil functions, crop yields are outcomes, farm income is outcome. And with humans, we kind of think about quality of life assessments and net worth or number of sick leave days, that sort of thing. So this analogy kind of holds, and we can take a couple different approaches to assessment. Bianca, will you advance to the next slide? There are qualitative assessments in both the human and the soil health assessment realms. These are more descriptive assessments, like how is your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? We try to kind of translate it into a semi-quantitative result, but it's a description of how someone is feeling. Or we can take a measurement of HDL cholesterol in the blood and have a measured, countable value. Next slide. So with soil health, we do have qualitative and quantitative measurements. This upper image is that of a slump test, which is part of the in-field assessment, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So it is a description of how that a soil sample is holding up to being exposed to water and gravity. And if it has good structure, good aggregate stability, it will hold together really well, like you can see on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, it has slumped down, spread apart. Some of those aggregates have broken up and individual particles are kind of coming out in that water. So we can see this and describe it and kind of have a measure of comparison between two samples. We can also measure aggregate stability in a quantitative way. The image below is a wet aggregate stability test with different mesh sizes for those sieves. And we expose a soil sample to water and agitation and calculate the volume of the aggregates that remain. And then we have a measurement, a quantitative measurement of aggregate stability. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we can assess soil health indicators in both quantitative and qualitative ways. They reflect the important functions of soil. For in-field assessment, that is a qualitative or semi-quantitative. It's very fast and it's in the field, in in the soil. You actually dig a hole and take a number of different approaches to looking at and evaluating the quality and health of the soil. It's really an incredible tool to initiate conversations about soil health, to understand what the soil is actually doing in the field. And then the laboratory assessment is a bit of a different approach. It's quantitative. You take a sample from the field and send it out for analysis in a laboratory with different methods and protocols to test the different indicators. And you'll get quantitative results back that can be compared to other soils and in different frameworks. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end here. But these numbers both have value and can be helpful in different ways. So next slide, Bianca. And back to you. Oh, you're muted, I think.
It would help if I unmuted. So when we were at NRCS, one of the things that we did is we developed a new set of soil health resource concerns, and we updated some of the ones that were there, because NRCS is very much, the conservation planning process is very much driven by the planner's ability to identify and document resource concerns. So they have to be able to go into the field and say, there's a problem here, therefore NRCS should fix it, therefore this landowner qualifies for financial assistance and technical assistance. However, we would bring a bunch of planners to our course, they would learn all about soil health, get excited about it, go back to their day-to-day job and say, well, I don't have anything I can check the box on so that I can get somebody to actually sign up for all these practices that I know they need. I can see it after everything you just taught me, but where do I put it, right? So we developed a new set of soil health resource concerns. We updated compaction and organic matter depletion that were there. We also added two more, one being soil organism habitat loss and degradation, and the other being aggregate instability. So these really key pieces about soil function that are all about, this is an ecosystem. There's billions of microbes. They're needing to have that habitat working, right? NRCS deals with above ground habitat all the time, but at the time they weren't dealing with below ground habitat. And so we inserted that. And then aggregate instability, there was really no place to put that explicitly. And so we inserted that into the soil health resource concerns. So a resource concern is an existing or expected degradation of soil, water, air, plant, or animal resources that's in the context of that sustainability or intended use of the resource, so that it doesn't get impaired, right? So a planner goes out, assesses the whole land and evaluates what the constraints might be beyond just soil. If I could get the slides to switch, that would be good. There we go. Okay, so cropland infield assessment was another tool that we developed. At the time, there were some states that had an infield assessment. There were others that didn't. The infield assessments were all different across the states. They were of different degree, and there was basically not any guidance. So our planners really needed a tool to go to the field with so that they could do exactly what Rachel just talked about. Have that conversation in the field, take a spade, look at the surface and say, okay, does it look like there's a resource concern? Does it look like there's a problem? So we sourced from all of the states everything that they were using at the time, asked them about which indicators were working best for them, how they were using them, and we basically built an infield soil health assessment from across all of the input from all of the states of everything they'd been using all of the most common ones that were scientifically valid, put them all into a national infield soil health assessment for which there is a technical note out. And basically the components of that were a field visit, a farmer interview on management and observations, and then using the web soil survey as the basis, and then going actually out to the field with a couple of simple tools, having some conversation, having that soil survey information, having a shovel, some knives, some water, some sink strainers, some infiltration ranks, a way to take notes, a camera and a color book, and that was really it, right? And you could skip the color book, there's different ways to do it, right? So you can go out there with really cheap tools. And this is actually something that those of you who do go out to the field and do walk the field with your landowners, you may want to take up some of these indicators as something that you look for actively as you're walking across the field, because it may just take a few minutes. Those of you who may not be familiar with web soil survey, NRCS publishes soils data in a mapped way. You can download a farm's map and it will tell you the inherent soil properties. And then there are some interpretations, like, for example, a limitations to soil health interpretation that basically shows you a little bit about how sensitive a soil might be and how responsive it might be to certain kinds of disturbances and to certain kinds of management practices. So there's a lot of information there. I'm not going to dive in during this session, but I want you to know it's there, it's available. Rachel and I have a fair bit of background on the system, and of course there's lots of people at NRCS that support landowners and their service providers on the use of this tool. So highly recommend it. It's a really great resource for good soils data that gives you a lot of insights on what you're starting with as you start to manage. So then there's the management history survey of the farmer, and that is published, and so you could download that and take a look at it and see if any of these questions are questions you might want to ask as you go out in the field. And then there's basically a list of resource concerns, a list of indicators that can help you assess resource concerns with basically yes or no. Is the threshold met? Does this indicator seem to indicate that everything's okay or that it's not? And it's a simple yes, no. It's very qualitative. There's not much quantitative about this assessment. It's just to get the foot in the door, take a quick look. A trained planner can go out there and in about maybe 10 minutes or so can look at a bunch of these indicators and have a pretty good idea of what the concerns might be. So I want to go through a couple of these indicators to see that you know that they're there. And if you're interested, there's a whole technical note that describes the use of this tool that we published while we were there. Adequate soil cover. We've talked a lot about soil cover, right? And if there's one of the principles that I would say is maybe the most easily approachable, it's, yeah, you want that soil to be covered, right? You want it to be protected from the wind, from the rain, from various, the heat. And so one of the indicators is there adequate soil cover? So for each of the indicators, there's a description of what it means, right? So you have soil cover is the percent of the soil surface that is covered by plant residue, organic mulch, and or live plants. Any of those count as soil cover. And then it tells you which of the NRCS designated resource concerns are addressed by the indicator. So if this indicator of adequate soil cover is lacking, it contributes to an assessment of any of these resource concerns being potential problems for that soil. And then there's rating criteria for each one. So for example, it meets criteria, which means that things are okay, right? Green, traffic light approach, you're good to go. If cover is greater than 75% after planting of the crop, then you're good to go. It does not meet criteria if cover is less than 75%. Now, you might say, okay, well, what about this crop? What about that crop? What about this soil type? What about that soil type? What about this climate, right? This is a national guidance kind of document. And the way NRCS puts it out there is they put it out to the states, and each state can then evaluate whether they want to reset these thresholds for their state. So if you're working in a particular state, you may want to check with the NRCS office to see whether there is a state, there's a changed version for that particular state with different thresholds that state prefers to use. What we're talking about in terms of soil cover, right? Any of these kinds of scenarios, do you have soil cover that allows these kinds of dust storms to happen where it's completely bare soil? Do you have a situation where you've got, fairly well stubble on the ground, where it's mostly covered, where it's, all the way covered except for where it just got planted in these rows, right? That's what we're assessing there. Surface crusts, a really important indicator of aggregate stability. Basically, if crusts form after a rain or after an irrigation event on soils, that means that there's weak aggregate stability. In the in-field assessment, you would evaluate that by visual observation after rain, after irrigation, after drying, right? So you can note whether there are crusts throughout the field or just in small patches, whether they are near the surface, whether there's layered sediment deposits on the surface, whether there's poor crop emergence or an uneven stand. All of those can help assess that. And so here again, rating criteria, right, meets the criteria if you have evidence of surface crust on less than 5% of your field, doesn't meet if it's more than 5% of your field. Some states may tweak that, but basically what you're looking for is this kind of crusting. Here's some pictures of crusts, right? If you pick up soil from the surface and it looks like this, that's a clear sign of soil health issues, right? If you've got cracking in between your corn rows like this, if you've got clear surface crusts across the top where it looks like it's all one smooth surface, like in this picture on the left, you've got some issues out there. Another indicator, ponding. And it's pretty fascinating. Even in dry climates, you can get ponding sometimes because you might get a rainstorm that dumps 3 inches all in 5 minutes. And I was actually in Arizona once when one of those happened. And I remember looking out the car window as this downpour was coming down after I had just gotten off the plane on my way to give a soil health talk. And here was water just running across the surface in streams, across the roads, running everywhere. By the time I got to the talk, it was over. There was almost no sign that that had happened. If you have ponding, yeah, you might have all of that flow together into a few little puddles where it's now ponding, but most of it is going to go off, right? So ponding is a sign that aggregates are not stable enough and that there's surface compaction going on, and that's going to be an issue because you're not going to be capturing that rainfall. So the further west you go, the more dry it is, the more valuable any water that does fall. Wouldn't it be nice if you could capture all of it in infiltration? It is possible. It's just we have to manage the soils right to do that. So again, you can go out in the field and make some basic observations. You can talk with a farmer about what visual observations they make after rainfall or irrigation. You can note any evidence of crop residue deposits as the water is flowing. You can see evidence of ponding from observations, sometimes from aerial photos. Sometimes you can see yellowing in the crop for where the ponding happened. So there's various things that you look for. And basically the criteria for this one are evidence that ponding 24 hours or less after the typical event, that after that it's gone. It does not meet the criteria if that ponding is still there 24 hours or more after a rain event. And here are some examples of ponding, right? Here's those couple of puddles in the field. Everything else didn't take that rain in, but there's a few puddles remaining in those low depressions. And later on in the season, if you're growing corn, you know about this, right? You get a wet spot and this is what your corn looks like after. That means a lot of nitrous oxide went into the air, by the way, and that's one of the biggest climate impacts of agriculture for the entire nation. So we don't want this happening for economical reasons, but also for greenhouse gas reasons, right? So there's, again, lots of reasons to fix those issues. Penetration resistance is basically an indicator of compaction. So again, we have a description, we have resource concerns, we have a way to conduct that, that in-field measurement or assessment. And you can do this a variety of ways. You can go in there with a penetrometer, which is actually a field measurement device that has a gauge at the top. You can actually measure in pounds per square inch how hard it is to push that into the soil. And we will have, I think, some of those available through this project. And if you would like one, then I think, hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn, but we probably have the funds to send you some.
Yes,
and then,
we do.
Okay, I thought so. So yeah, those are very useful tools, make for great conversation in the field. You can also just go out there with a little wire flag and poke it in the ground and see what you see. You can look for platy structure, you put a spade in the ground, and if you see this kind of parallel to the ground cracking, you've got a compaction issue. If you've got roots, okay, so here's a picture of the penetrometer, right? There's that gauge. Here's this guy trying to get into the ground and with all of his weight, not managing to make it in. If you've got roots that take a turn like this, that's a clear sign of compaction. If you dig up a clod of roots and you get something nice and fibrous like this, that's a pretty good sign that that soil is easy for those roots to grow in. If you get something like this, well, that one lone little root doesn't have access to all of the water, all of the nutrients that are in this big clod of such massive compacted soil that it just can't get in. So there is no value to all of that valuable stuff, the water, the nutrients in that soil, if the root can't get to it, if it's too compacted. Finally, aggregate stability, another really great one. I think this is one of by far the best indicators of soil health. There are various ways to assess it in the field pretty quickly. The slake test, if you haven't watched those videos yet, please do. That slake test is amazing. It's really visually compelling, and it has changed a lot of farmers' minds. There's actually farmers who tell stories about how they came to one of the soil health trainings and they saw that demonstration of the slake test and their mind has been changed forever, and they went home and started changing their practices. So that's how that's how impactful that test is. The strainer test, you get a couple of sink strainers. Rachel just showed that. And there's also an aggregate stability test that's a little more quantitative that was developed at the Jornada. And again, you know, there's some criteria for when the test meets and when the test doesn't meet, and you can basically go out there and assess that pretty quickly. And we've talked through these concepts. So here are some images of that slump test, right? Here's the soil totally puddling, falling apart versus nice granular browny kind of structure, right? Here again, this soil kind of flowing apart and getting puddled, and this looks much more solid, right? So you see something like this on a field, you know there's a problem. You see dust storms like this, you know there's a problem, right? Plant roots and biopores. You can look at your roots as they go through, and if you are seeing nice channels like this, maybe even with some dark organic matter that are a sign that the roots follow the same channel every year and are doing pretty well, it's a good sign. You get this kind of really nice fibrous rooting, and you get soil sticking to the roots because they're putting out plenty of glues. Those are great signs, right? So you can look at roots, you can look at biopores, and again, use that as an indicator of soil health. Now, how are you going to track all this? There happens to be an app for that. Our colleague at ARS developed Land PKS and a mobile app where he basically took this in-field assessment that we developed and stuck it into the app so that anybody out there that's using that particular framework can also use the soil health module and assess for soil health. So that's qualitative in-field assessments, but there's also much more quantitative approaches, and that's basically, okay, we want to really take our soil to the doctor. We want to actually do a laboratory test. We talked about how most soil testing in the past has been for nutrient management purposes, and how we basically look for, you know, where's that low point? You know, is nitrogen missing? Is phosphorus missing? Is potassium missing? And that's basically what drives crop growth. That's really critical. But what we have found out is that beyond this paradigm of nutrients that has been talked about for so long and that has been very successful, there's these biological and physical abilities of the soil to function that are really critical to also look at, because they really end up limiting how that soil functions. And so we have worked to add that new component to publicly available frameworks to actually have soil health testing, to look more holistically. So, you know, this is still a work in progress. We came into this space where standard nutrient tests were available. They did macronutrients, micronutrients, sometimes soil organic matter, sometimes CEC. And now we've got a bunch of indicators that have been carefully evaluated that are now actually available in NRCS policy. You can get technical assistance and financial assistance for soil health testing. Conservation Evaluation and Monitoring Activity, or SEMA 216, is now actually in place. It's available across the country. It's really exciting that we've managed to make that happen. And it's imperfect, right? Because our interpretations aren't yet available and rock solid across the entire country for all production systems, for all soil types. We're not there yet, but I think there's enough work that has happened that this is more useful than not having it. And, you know, here on the left, you can see a little bit of the history. I was involved in when we first put out the initial soil health test at Cornell University, made it available to the public at first just in New York State, then kind of expanded across the coast, and then really kind of pulled that framework into NRCS and said, look, this really needs to be something the agency does, and made a bunch of progress. So some key things for those indicators, they really need to be standardized, right? If we don't have standard protocols for how these things are measured, it's really hard to get enough data that you can get good interpretations happening. And it's really hard to provide the guidance on what that indicator even means. You know, you got some value back from the lab. What does it mean to have 50% aggregate stability? Well, it depends on how you measured it, and it depends on what soil type it's in, and it depends on how you managed it, and all sorts of other things. The indicators that we measure need to have scientific and agronomic relevance, right? Does this actually matter to soil functions that matter for crop growth? They need to represent the diverse processes, right? We need to test for all the various functions that are important. We need to test for broken bones, as well as to whether we have a stomach bug, as well as whether we've got COVID, if we want a holistic picture of what's going on with somebody. We need easy and inexpensive ways of measuring so that it can actually be offered to the public. That's certainly still a work in progress. Right now, we're talking about $150, $160 per test to get a holistic picture. And that's kind of up there. Not everybody's willing to pay that. And of course, they need to be sensitive to agricultural management, and interpretations need to be accessible to the public. So passing to you, Rachel.
Okay, sorry about that. So with this soil health testing activity that NRCS supports, we have selected 5 different indicators that represent general soil function. So aggregate stability, we've kind of talked about that as really a fundamental assessment and indicator for soil structure, how soils will partition and cycle water. We also do an analysis of soil organic carbon to reflect carbon and organic matter cycling. There's the permanganate oxidizable carbon, which is measuring the kind of active or labile carbon available in the soil that reflects carbon as a food source that can be easily metabolized by organisms. There's a measure of microbial activity in general. So that is short-term carbon mineralization or respiration. It's a measurement of CO2 that the microbes exhale as they are metabolizing food and living their best lives in the soil. And then a measure of biologically available nitrogen measured by the method called acid citrate extractable protein. So those are intended, they were built out to represent key soil functions, and they are pretty well accepted methods that are applied across the country, because a lot of that being able to interpret it is that we can take these indicators, we understand how they've been processed and the method used in the lab, so we can understand sort of how to interpret the results. Next slide. So these are, again, side-by-side pictures, but very different soils, and a representation of how different indicators behave in different soil types. So we've got Georgia ultisol, which is pretty highly weathered, high sand content, low organic matter. And you can see in that Georgia soil, the changes in management will affect organic matter, but there'll be some limitation on how to interpret the baseline score and the change in the organic matter content. For Iowa mollisol, generally inherently higher organic matter, you see the scale from 0 to 6%. We'll never be able to get an ultisol in Georgia likely up to that level. It's possible. I shouldn't say never, but the change and interpretation of those values should be relative to the type of soil, the texture of the soil, and the climate. So we build these soil functions, these scoring functions based on data sets, and we'll kind of get into some of the frameworks on the next slide. So soil health laboratory assessment has been developed and researched in a couple of different ways across the country over the last 20 years or so. It started with the Soil Management Assessment Framework, or SMAF, is kind of the earliest framework, and that image at the top left is from the foundational paper of that framework. So they selected a minimum data set with a number of indicators that had interpretations based on the data, the database that was built at the USDA with data from Georgia, Iowa, California, and the Pacific Northwest, and interpreted those values for the different indicators and scored them, and then integrated that score into an index value. There were other tests that were developed kind of in parallel in time, a soil health tool that is also called the Haney test. That took a little bit of a different approach with the different types of methods used to assess some of the functions. So they used water extractants or a really mild acid extractant for nutrient measurements, and then a CO2 evolution to kind of put together the pieces of soil health and how those nutrients would function under kind of ambient conditions. Then, like Bianca was talking about, the Cornell assessment, the comprehensive assessment of soil health, that kind of came about at around the same time. 2006 was the manual publication. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bianca. So there are a bunch of indicators in that cache test, and they use that similar sort of framework structure where the individual indicators are scored and interpreted based on the distribution of the data. And for Cornell, they drew upon their New York soils, but also, like Bianca mentioned, expanded to the Northeast. And they're starting to get more samples from across the country now and expanding their data set. So the scores then are integrated into an index value, and there's an overall soil health score in a Cornell cache report. And then we have another framework that emerged in the early 2020s through USDA called SHAPE. That's the Soil Health Assessment Protocol and Evaluation Tool. And that built on both cache and SMAFS data sets. So it's a national data set, but it's a little bit different. It's not a framework in the sense that it takes multiple indicators and creates an index value, but scores the individual indicators based on the distribution. And we'll kind of take a quick look at that on the next slide. Before we move on though, the Soil Health Institute has the North American project to evaluate soil health measurements. And that started in early 2010s. They just put out a publication on a minimum set of indicators that they recommend. And so really it's an active space where people are collecting information across the country. The Soil Health Institute's work is North American, so there's Canadian, US, and Mexico representative samples and interpretations. So very active space for research and especially on the interpretation side. Next slide, please. And I'll kind of move through this rather quickly. We've only got a couple minutes. So for SHAPE, that is built into the soil health assessment or the soil health testing activity that NRCS supports. And it's a publication out of an ARS group of researchers and collaborators from Cornell and others. But it takes into account the mean annual temperature and mean annual precipitation of the sample of the soil. There's a texture category and a soil suborder category. So it takes into those inherent properties and the environmental properties, and then uses the model to produce a score or a mean value compared to the other soils in the database. So that's part of the assessment for the soil health testing activity. And we'll go back to you, Bianca.
So as you can see, it's a really active space, and there's a lot of work still needing to be done. But I would say that we're getting to a point where for a number of these indicators, we do have some idea of how that sample compares to others in the region, right? If a lot of farmers on degraded soils are coming up with 30 or 40% aggregate stability, and a farmer has 80%, well, we know that they're doing really well, right? The Cornell framework actually put together a report form that highlights the indicators that are in the red, and that's something that SHAPE is going towards. So that was an active collaboration, taking all of these previous frameworks and the science that has happened there to move that forward for the nation. The basic framework, though, for what you do with these soil health assessments is basically to identify where is the constraint and what do I do about it, right? So in the short term, for example, if your aggregate stability is low, you might need to incorporate fresh organic materials, use shallow rooted cover crops, rotation crops, add green manure, add mulch, add manure. In the long term, you might want to think about reducing tillage, using a surface mulch in the long run, rotating with sod crops or mycorrhizal hosts, right? So for each one of these indicators that come up low in the assessment, there are short-term and long-term management suggestions that a farmer that can then look at and say, okay, well, this one works for me, this one doesn't work for me, this one works in a couple of years from now, this one I can implement right now. And I just want to give you one brief example of a farm, again, Dorn Cox's farm that I worked with in New Hampshire. They had a pond that looked like this, right? I mean, clear sign of way too much phosphorus, but the standard nutrient test that said that phosphorus was very low, pH was also very low. When we took a soil health assessment, we realized that they had really strong compaction. And so we went about this with a soil health ecosystem kind of mind frame, saying, okay, you know, the habitat isn't working right. It's very compacted. The aggregates are stable, but they're squished together. Nothing, the water can't infiltrate into the soil. And they were running some horses on this pasture. And yeah, they were getting some manure that soil really needed, right? It was low in phosphorus. It really could stand to have some extra organic matter. But basically that manure was getting deposited on the surface, and during heavy rains would run straight into the pond, causing nutrient issues in the pond, not benefiting the soil. So we took a shank through there, basically subsoiled this, and planted some sorghum Sudan grass to try to get some deep tap roots in, and I think added some wood ash at the time, and basically that brought the pH back up, and you know, phosphorus started actually becoming available, and as the pH went back up, and we had a nice clover crop growing, and the pond totally cleared up within about a year, right? So holistic view, you know, really making sure that you understand all of these, and I think that this could happen anywhere. You know, it's a framework that basically looks at where are the issues and how do we address those issues so that we can improve the problems that we have. So don't think we have time to discuss right now, but Rachel and I are around. I think there's lots of ways to use this. We'd be happy to answer more questions, and back to you, Chris.
Great, thank you. That was terrific. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Bianca. Let's take time. If somebody has a question, let's give you guys, we can shave into the break just a tiny bit. So I want to give a chance for folks to ask questions if they have ones.
I had something to add that I should have mentioned. A lot of times with assessments, both in field and lab, it's very helpful to either have a baseline measurement or have a reference measurement. So something to compare to, because like we talked about how the different soil types in different parts of the country will have different values for the indicator. So if you're working in an operation, you might take a sample from the middle of the field and a fence row, just to have an idea of how that soil might compare with under different management or lack of management. But it's a good starting point. It really helps to frame it.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Okay, last call. Questions?
Yes, Eric.
Yeah, hi guys again. This was really helpful. I mean, this is where I think the rubber meets the road for the kind of stuff that I do, and I'm wondering about. So the field, I'm gonna have to go through all this again and just see how I might want to incorporate this into our regular monitoring. And what you were saying, Rachel, about baselines just makes me wonder about at some point doing some kind of quantitative assessment. Maybe it's a lab test across all of our different protected farms, and with the 5 different ones that were mentioned. I guess you might have mentioned this, Rachel, but if you guys could say again, maybe that if I were to go do that and say get some lab test done based on one of these frameworks or approaches, the SHAPE or SHI or whatever, is there one that stands out right now for this kind of work that we should be focused on? I might have missed that.
It kind of depends on where you are. I think we now actually have a list of labs that does provide sort of the holistic look of biological, physical, and chemical indicators. I would say the important thing is to get, in my perspective, get more rather than fewer. It's great, like Soil Health Institute really narrowed things down to just 4. I think that's great for when you're trying to take tons of samples just to get, some kind of number on the books. But if you're really trying to assess where are we at with all soil function, it'd be good to get a full set. Cornell, I think, is still the only lab that does like a colorful report that's really interpretive, but the interpretations are not yet adapted to Western systems, as far as I understand. I don't know what the other labs are. I don't know, Rachel, if you know particular labs, but we can certainly look into which labs are available in your state. And the quantitative values of the laboratory indicators are going to be what they are, and you can compare relatively between your benchmark sample, your baseline sample, and anything in the future. Great,
yeah, and most of the farmers I work with do get their regular soil, like annual soil tests, and I guess it might be worth collaborating with them too if there's already doing it anyway, then figuring out what it's saying, and then otherwise how it relates to some of the things we're learning here.
And it might be worth inquiring with NRCS whether they qualify for 216, because that way they can get it paid for by NRCS versus your land trust needing to pay for it. So wherever that's an option, that's worth looking into.
Okay, thanks.
Carrie.
Great. And I want to recognize that Carrie has a question. Carrie, ask your question, and then we will go on break. I don't want people to think we're not going to take a break. So go ahead, Carrie, because.
Yeah. So I was just looking at the action plan thing, and I saw in here about sending stewardship or monitoring staff to NRCS soil health conservation training. Is that which could be really great for a lot of us. Is that something that each state office offers, or is that a national thing, or how would we find out about those opportunities?
Rachel, do you know where things are at right now with NRCS? Because I'm not sure. I know that they have had technical service provider trainings offered virtually at times, and states will often put on trainings for their planners and for potentially sometimes other interested public. And often in a state, NRCS will put on soil health workshops of various sorts in the areas that they think are most important. So it very much depends on the state, but getting you in touch with your NRCS and saying, hey, we're really interested in any workshops. What do you have coming? How can we get on your list to make sure that we know what you've got coming? And maybe with your neighboring states, if you're close to a border too, because it's going to be valuable. And sometimes one state is doing a lot and the other state next door is doing nothing at all. And so it's good to tap into whatever resources you've got.
Right. And that, again, goes back to us within the next year, helping to connect you all to the right state and federal resources in your state. So stay tuned on that. So thank you again, Bianca. Thank you, Rachel. That was great.